On his birthday, my son looked me dead in the eyes and said, "From now on, you're just an observer. Not a partner, not a father, just an observer." That was the moment I realized something in him had hardened. I nodded, pretending not to flinch, but inside something broke. Ethan had always been ambitious. I admired that. I even encouraged it, probably more than I should have. He was still in high school when I brought him into the family business, had him sitting in on small vendor meetings, letting him see the gears of what I built with calloused hands and long nights. Back then he had the eager eyes of a boy who admired his father. Somewhere along the line, that admiration curdled into calculation. We hadn't spoken much in the past year. Tension had grown like mold between us, silent, dark, and difficult to scrub off. I knew he was angling for control, aligning with investors who preferred younger blood, slicker suits, and leaner ethics. I chose to give him space, not because I trusted him, but because I wanted to. So when his assistant called, not Ethan himself, to invite me to an upcoming acquisition meeting, I felt a strange chill. "Mr. Reed," she said, overly formal, "Ethan asked if you'd be willing to attend the final stage meeting next Thursday. Your presence would be appreciated." Appreciated? I built the damn company. My name was still on the paperwork, even if it was slowly being pushed to the margins. I asked, "Did he say why he wants me there?" "He just said you'd know when the time comes. Oh, and he requests that you don't speak during the meeting. He said to just observe." Observe, there was that word again. I arrived at the glass tower that used to bear our name. Now it was just an acronym. Stripped of history, clean and cold. The receptionist didn't recognize me. That stung more than I expected. When the elevator doors opened to the top floor, Ethan greeted me with a politician's smile. Measured, empty. "Glad you could make it," he said. No hug, no handshake, just those practiced words. "I almost didn't," I replied flatly. He adjusted his cufflinks and avoided eye contact. "Just don't say anything, okay? It'll go smoother that way." And there it was again. The unspoken truth between us. I was no longer a part of his story, just a background figure to lend credibility, a relic to sit quietly while he performed his masterpiece. I followed him into the boardroom, where suits buzzed with quiet urgency. Papers were stacked, laptops open. The air smelled of expensive coffee and ambition. He took the seat at the head of the table, my seat once, and began presenting to men whose names I'd never heard. I sat in silence like he asked, but my eyes saw everything, and what I saw would change everything. Friends, let me take a quick pause here. Would you mind writing in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced anything like this in your own life? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing and sharing this video. It's a small action that helps us grow and continue bringing you powerful stories like this one. Now, let's continue. I remember the first time I held a wrench with frozen fingers working out of a rented garage that didn't even have proper heating. The walls were cracked, the concrete floor soaked with oil and cold, and my hands didn't look like hands anymore. They were tools themselves, cracked, stiff, reliable. That was the beginning. No investors, no safety net. Just me, a stubborn dream, and a wife who believed in me more than I deserved. We started with 2 machines. One borrowed, one paid off in monthly chunks so small. The man selling it to me laughed and said, "You'll owe me till your grandkids grow old." I didn't laugh, I just nodded and got to work. I missed birthdays, I missed dinners, I missed sleep. I promised myself it was all for the future, for him. When Ethan was born, I thought, this is it. This is who I'm building all this for. I remember the way he used to walk around the shop floor as a little boy, with his oversized goggles and toy clipboard, mimicking my every move. He'd tug on my sleeve and ask questions about gears and gauges with the kind of wide-eyed curiosity that makes you believe in something bigger than yourself. Every time I thought about giving up, and there were many times, I'd picture him older, standing at the helm of this thing I built. I wanted him to inherit more than just a company. I wanted him to inherit meaning, but maybe I should have paid more attention to the way he looked at the numbers rather than the people. Maybe I should have noticed how early he learned to say what others wanted to hear, how naturally he made deals behind doors that hadn't even been opened yet. Maybe I mistook charm for character. When he was in college, I gave him his first official role. Junior analyst, no special treatment. I thought it would humble him. It didn't. He soared, sharp, fast, too fast. His ideas were brilliant, yes, but colder than mine. He spoke of efficiency like it was a god, even if it meant cutting corners and people. He started dressing different, talking different, surrounding himself with men who had never stepped on a factory floor. I'd walk into meetings and suddenly feel like I didn't belong. He didn't say it outright, but I could feel it in the way he introduced me. This is my father. He started the company. Started, past tense. I stayed on as chairman. I thought my presence mattered. That maybe, just maybe, some piece of what I built still flowed through his veins. But as the years passed, the name changed. The values shifted. The mission blurred. And now I sat in a boardroom filled with strangers, listening to him speak about legacy while erasing mine in real time. He didn't even know he was doing it. Or maybe he did. And that's what hurt most. Success hadn't just changed him, it had revealed him. And I was finally beginning to see my own reflection in his, not in the pride of what he had become, but in the loss of what I thought I was building. Maybe I hadn't built a legacy. Maybe I'd just handed over a loaded weapon to someone who thought power was the prize. But I stayed quiet. I had to. Because what they didn't know, what he didn't know, was that the final chapter of this story wasn't being written in that boardroom. It was being written in silence, in patience, and in justice. The morning of the meeting, I stood outside the building for a long time, longer than I should have. The glass tower loomed over me like a monument, tall, spotless, reflective. It caught the sun in a way that almost blinded you if you looked up for too long. I didn't remember approving a design like that. Maybe I had. Maybe I was already stepping back when the architects presented it, already trusting Ethan with more than just the floor plans. A black car pulled up, tinted windows, sleek and quiet. Men in suits walked past me, barely glancing my way. Some of them worked for my company, or what used to be mine. They didn't recognize me. I wore an old brown coat, the kind that clung to the past, not on purpose, but because it still fit and still worked, much like me. I stepped into the lobby, and everything felt foreign. Gone were the oil paintings of the original factory. Gone were the photographs of our first team, the gritty, smiling faces who helped me through those impossible early years. In their place were steel sculptures, automated reception, touchscreens on every wall. Modern, cold, efficient. I gave my name. The receptionist smiled politely and tapped on her tablet. She didn't know who I was. She didn't need to. I wasn't there for me. I was there for my son. As the elevator rose, I told myself this could be the beginning of something new. Maybe, I thought, this meeting wasn't just about numbers or documents. Maybe it was Ethan's way of reaching out, clumsily, awkwardly, but sincerely. Maybe he'd finally realized that no matter how high you climb, you still need solid ground to stand on. Maybe I was that ground. I remembered his 6th birthday, the one where I forgot to come home on time. I was welding a broken conveyor belt in the warehouse, grease all over my arms, sparks in my eyes, and I missed the cake, the candles, the look on his face. I walked in 3 hours late and tried to explain, but he didn't say a word, just turned away and went upstairs. I remember standing there, gifts in one hand, my tool bag in the other, feeling like I'd just burned down something precious without even knowing it. Since then, I'd tried to make up for all the absences, the games I didn't attend, the nights I worked too late, the dinners I answered emails through. I tried in the only way I knew how, by building, by creating something I could hand over and say, "This is yours. This is what I made for you." But maybe I'd built the wrong thing. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. The 42nd floor, boardroom level. I took a breath and stepped into the hallway, carpeted in something that looked too soft to walk on, the kind of place you whispered in, not spoke. His assistant greeted me, young, polished, rehearsed. She offered me coffee, asked if I needed anything. I didn't. I just wanted to see my son. When he walked out of the conference room, his suit looked tailored to power. His watch probably cost more than what I made my first year running the business. His hair was neat, but his eyes were tired. "Dad," he said, almost surprised to see me. I managed a small smile. "I got your message." He nodded once, like he was already somewhere else in his mind. Then the words came again, softer this time, but no less pointed. "Just stay quiet, okay?" I nodded again. But in that moment, something inside me resisted the command, not out of pride, not even out of pain, but because I still had hope. Hope that behind the walls he'd built around himself, the ambition, the armor, the arrogance. The boy who once ran through the factory floor with toy goggles and a grin was still somewhere in there. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of something. Maybe this was the beginning of coming home. Just listen, please don't say anything. These people are powerful. He said it like he was warning me, not inviting me, like I was a fragile piece of old furniture that needed to be moved quietly, tucked in a corner and covered with a sheet so the important guests wouldn't be distracted. I wanted to believe it was nerves, that maybe the pressure was getting to him, that he just needed to focus. But his voice was too polished, too practiced. It wasn't my son speaking to me. It was a man who had already decided where I fit in the room. I nodded, said nothing. My chest tightened. Not with anger, not yet, but with something worse. Grief. The kind you can't explain to anyone, because the person you're grieving is still standing right in front of you, breathing, talking, but no longer yours. He walked ahead, checking his phone, adjusting his cufflinks. I followed, not because I was invited, but because I was still holding on to some foolish idea that maybe he'd look back, just once. Maybe he'd offer me a seat next to him at the table. Maybe he'd smile and say, "Glad you're here." But he didn't. He never even turned around. The boardroom was all glass and chrome, a place where nothing could hide. But somehow everything felt hidden. I could feel the heat of eyes on me when I walked in. A few of the men looked up, assessed me, then looked away like I was an interruption to their agenda. I knew the look. I'd seen it before, years ago when I used to walk into banks asking for loans with calloused hands and second-hand shoes. They didn't know who I was, and clearly Ethan didn't want them to know. There were no introductions, no acknowledgments, just an extra chair in the corner away from the head of the table, away from him. That's where I sat. And so I did what he asked. I stayed silent, but I listened. I listened as my company, the one I built from blueprints and broken nights, was reduced to charts and percentages. I listened as Ethan pitched the acquisition like it was a triumph. He spoke with conviction, with clarity. He used words like agility and modernization and streamlining legacy structures. Every word was a knife, cutting ties to what once was. There was no mention of the team that built our first prototype in a leaky basement with a space heater and sheer will. No stories about the late-night shifts or the clients we won over by being honest when it wasn't profitable. No mention of me. Not even a quiet nod to the foundation beneath his feet. To them, this was Ethan's company, his vision, his brilliance. And I was, a placeholder, a signature, a formality? At one point, the lead investor leaned forward and said, "And you're confident the founder will agree to the terms?" Ethan didn't even glance at me. Absolutely. That was the moment something shifted in me. It wasn't betrayal. That would come later. No, this was something colder. It was the realization that I wasn't part of this conversation at all. I wasn't a voice in the room. I was a checkbox on a list. My silence was useful to him. My presence? Merely symbolic. But I kept listening. I watched every move. Every document slid across the table. Every agreement made behind guarded language. I saw the terms. I saw the faces. I saw the truth. He didn't need my blessing. He needed my name. And somewhere deep inside, a question stirred. Had I really built a company? Or had I built a weapon someone else now held in their hands, aimed at everything I loved? The room applauded as the pitch ended. Papers were shuffled, deals were practically sealed, and still I sat. Quiet, just as he asked. But silence isn't the same as surrender. Not when it's filled with memory, not when it's watching, measuring, waiting. He didn't know it yet, but something had awakened in me that day, and I wasn't done. The room smelled like polished wood and expensive cologne, a sterile kind of power. There was no dust here, no fingerprints, just glass, metal, and silence that meant business. Suits filled the table. Men who had never seen a machine jam on a factory floor or wiped sweat off their brows at 3 a.m. These were men who moved numbers, not weight. They walked in with clipped accents and sharp smiles, eyes scanning, calculating. They weren't here to honor a legacy. They were here to take it, reshape it, flip it, and profit from it. And at the head of the table stood my son, Ethan. Tall, polished, certain. He looked like he belonged there. And in some way, I suppose he did. He had spent the last 10 years building this image, not just the company's, but his own. The confident strategist, the visionary leader, the kind of man who didn't just walk into boardrooms, but commanded them. I watched him adjust the collar of his dark suit, the watch on his wrist catching the light. I had given him that watch the day he graduated college. He never used to wear it. I wonder now if he put it on today for effect. To remind me, or perhaps himself, of the boy I once believed in, he began to speak. I didn't recognize his voice at first. It was measured, rehearsed. Not the voice that once cracked with excitement when he first grasped the idea of profit margins. Not the voice that had once whispered across dinner tables about ideas, dreams, and what we could build together. He spoke in figures, charts, forecasts. He talked about market saturation, strategic alignment, and long-term scalability. And the numbers, God, the numbers, they were mine. I taught him to read those numbers. Taught him how to understand the rhythm of revenue and risk. How to spot a lie hidden in a spreadsheet. How to know when to bet and when to hold. Now he spun them like weapons. Each projection a bullet, each percentage a cut. He didn't speak of people, not the ones who gave their best years to this company, who stayed late to fix broken machines, who showed up on snow-covered roads just to keep a shipment moving. He didn't speak of my late wife, his mother, who once ran the books by hand while rocking him to sleep with her foot. He didn't speak of home. Because to Ethan, this company wasn't a home anymore. It was a platform, a stepping stone, a product to be dressed up and sold to the highest bidder. The room listened, nodded, admired. Some whispered to each other with smiles, already seeing the numbers in their heads multiplying. No one looked at me. No one asked me to speak. I felt like a portrait on the wall, symbolic, silent, and easily removed when the decor changed. Still, I listened. I watched every chart click onto the screen, every smug glance between investors, every legal term that buried emotion under cold structure, and slowly my grief turned into clarity, into a kind of righteous stillness, because I saw now what I hadn't wanted to believe. Ethan wasn't just cutting me out. He was cutting everything out, everything we built, everything we stood for. He was selling it away like outdated furniture. And worse, he wasn't doing it out of desperation. He was doing it with pride, with ambition, with precision. He had become the very thing I spent my life fighting against, the kind of man who believed money was the only legacy worth leaving behind. He spoke about the acquisition as if it were the inevitable evolution of our business, as if divesting the company from its roots was a natural and necessary act. But I knew better. What he was doing wasn't evolution, it was erasure. And I was still sitting in the corner, still quiet, still watching. But something inside me had shifted. Not anger, not yet. Something deeper, a slow rising fire. Because I had built this house brick by brick, and now I was watching my own blood set fire to the foundation. He didn't know it yet. But I had come prepared. He stood before them, chest forward, chin high, and spoke as though the company's birth had sprung from his own mind. "This is our vision for the future," he declared, and a polished slide appeared. The company's logo, gleaming and new. I blinked, expecting to see the old emblem tucked in a corner, an homage to everything that came before. But it was gone. The vintage script I'd sketched on my kitchen table, the emblem his mother had adored, erased without a trace. My heart pounded. I wasn't invisible, but they treated me as if I were. When he spoke, my name never slipped from his lips, not once. I, who had spent decades negotiating raw materials in foreign cities, who had learned 3 languages in order to secure a single contract, who had been told no so many times I'd memorized the sound of disappointment, was reduced to a footnote. "A long-time supporter," he said, sliding through the words too quickly for any real weight to settle. A long-time supporter. I felt like a ghost in the room, tethered only by my own memories. I remembered the first prototype we built in that creaky garage, the late nights when every bolt felt like a victory, the day we paid off the first loan and stood on the concrete floor, tears streaming down both our faces. I remembered holding Ethan in one arm while drafting blueprints with the other, whispering into his ear that anything was possible. And now? Now my own son was stripping that history away, as if it never mattered. I thought I'd made peace with change. I embraced progress. I encouraged innovation. But this felt different. It wasn't evolution, it was erasure. He was telling a story in that boardroom, and my chapter wasn't in the book anymore. He painted pictures of streamlined structures and brand reinvention, and the partners nodded as if he'd stumbled onto the cure for some corporate illness. They applauded his slides, but they didn't applaud the hands that had once sketched those slides, the hands that had built this business from the ground up. They didn't see the woman who had typed invoices by candlelight when the power went out. They didn't see the hundreds of employees who'd thanked him for our family's generosity during hard times. They didn't see the scars on the workshop floor from all the times things exploded when prototypes failed. All of that, my sacrifices, our shared history, evaporated in a breathless moment of presentation. My chest felt hollow, but my mind sharpened. The pain of that erasure cut deep, but beneath it grew a steely resolve. If he wanted to pretend none of it existed, he'd only forced me to remember every detail even more vividly. Every late delivery, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer over labor disputes, etched in me like lines on a map. When the segment ended and polite murmurs spread around the table, I sat still. I refused to let anger betray me. Instead, I bottled it, letting it fuse with memory and purpose. They might have erased my name from the narrative, but I still held the pen to the ledger, and they didn't know it yet, but I was ready to rewrite the conclusion. The moment they clicked to the next slide, everything shifted. What had felt like a presentation became a strategy session for conquering a kingdom. The air in the room grew thick with ambition, the kind that smells like cold steel and polished shoes. I watched their faces soften with desire as the numbers transformed into charts of dominion, market shares to be seized, competitor lines to be crossed, territories to be claimed. Ethan stood there, pointer in hand, voice calm and measured, but inside, I felt the tremor of betrayal. This wasn't about growth, it was about conquest. He wasn't guiding a ship, he was plotting an invasion, and the targets were the very foundations I had laid brick by brick. Each graph was a map to dismantle what we had built. Our factories, our loyal customer base, even the company's humble, community-driven roots. Now it was all collateral in his game for power. They spoke of synergies as though they were gifts. Shared resources, streamlined processes, maximized profits. But to me, they sounded like chains, tightening around everything we once held dear. I remembered gathering our small team around a battered table, listening to their worries about layoffs and benefits. I remembered promising them that our company would always stand by its people first. Now those same promises were being auctioned off, piece by piece, for the allure of prestige. Ethan clicked again, revealing the final offer, a number so staggering it made the room collectively inhale. A takeover bid that would eclipse the company's annual revenue by nearly 50%, rewarding investors with windfall returns, and giving Ethan the golden ticket to a seat on a far larger board. He would trade his birthright, our legacy of community and craftsmanship, for a title, a corner office in a skyscraper, and the privilege of rubbing shoulders with the elite. I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides. This was never about safeguarding our future. It was about elevating his status. I saw it in his eyes, how his pupils dilated at the thought of that coveted seat, how the lines at his temples smoothed over with excitement. He had fallen in love not with the business itself, but with the reflection of success it could cast onto his own image. And the investors, they leaned forward, hungry. They admired his audacity, his willingness to dismantle decades of tradition for the promise of market domination. They saw him as a visionary. I saw him as a stranger, willing to sacrifice everything he inherited for a taste of power. At that moment, I realized the meeting was a funeral for everything we had built. The pitched acquisition deal was not a partnership, it was an extinction event. The machinery that once clanked in late-night workshops would fall silent. The community partnerships we nurtured would dissolve into press releases. The small victories, like helping a struggling supplier stay afloat, would be footnotes lost in the torrent of corporate press. He didn't just sell a company. He sold our story. He sold our sweat. He sold the belief that business could be built on more than just numbers. And I sat there, silent and robed in rage, feeling both a father's grief and a founder's fury. Because if this was the real agenda, to tear down everything for the sake of ego, then I had to act, and I had to act swiftly. What they saw as the closing of a deal, I saw as the opening move in a battle for the soul of our legacy. And I was no longer willing to stay silent. I looked at him, the man who once clung to my leg in the living room, eyes wide with wonder, and felt a jolt of recognition. He didn't meet my eyes, not once. His gaze skimmed over me like I was glass, transparent, untouchable, irrelevant. In that moment, something cold and hard cracked inside me. This wasn't sudden. This betrayal had been planned, nurtured in whispered phone calls and tidy lunches where words were chosen like weapons, wrapped in polite smiles and distant pleasantries. I remembered the way he used to rush into my workshop as a boy, cheeks shining with excitement, begging to help unscrew a bolt or oil a gear. Now, his movements were precise, reserved, a performance. I realized those early mornings when he asked to shadow me weren't about learning the trade, but about gathering intel. The dinners I sacrificed so he could network with industry insiders were cover for secret meetings, forging alliances that would one day displace me. Every cordial email, every reserved nod of agreement in our private strategy sessions had birthed this moment, a boardroom takeover crafted behind my back. I felt the years of trust unravel like frayed rope. The same hands I'd held as he took his first steps were now folded in front of him, controlled and distant. His heartbeat, once in sync with mine as we celebrated each small victory, now pounded to the rhythm of projections and power plays. I saw it in the way he never referred to we anymore, only I and us, as though he had recast our family into a faceless corporation. I felt it in the hollow pause when I entered his office unannounced and found half-drunk coffee cups beside folders stamped with other names, other plans. I heard it in his voice when he delivered constructive feedback about my outdated methods, as if the rusted machines I still cherished were relics hindering his grand design. He had traded the warmth of our shared history for the cold gleam of opportunity. And somehow I had been blind, distracted by the day-to-day grind, proud of his rise, dismissing the small fractures that formed between us. Now those fractures had become chasms. As I sat there, the polished floor reflecting rows of expectant faces, I realized that betrayal wasn't a single act, but a slow erosion of loyalty. And beneath the shock, beneath the fury, a new resolve took shape. If he believed he could dismantle everything we built without consequence, he hadn't counted on the founder's instinct that still lived in me, an instinct to protect what's yours, no matter the cost. In that instant, with his eyes refusing to meet mine, I ceased to be his passive audience. I became something else, a man betrayed, wounded, but not defeated, ready to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I didn't speak. I listened to the soft click of the PowerPoint advancing, watched the sheen of enthusiasm on their faces as they digested each slide, and in that quiet, I saw everything. The buried clauses, those footnotes in fine print that guaranteed layoffs if performance dipped by even a fraction. The deceitful metrics, projected growth curves inflated beyond reality as if they expected the market to bow to their will. I saw the smirks exchanged between investors as Ethan assured them they could trim redundant roles without disrupting productivity, as though people were nothing more than cogs destined to spin or be discarded. My pulse hammered in my ears while they admired the deal's elegant structure. To them it was perfect engineering. To me it was a blueprint for betrayal. Each term was a blade, aimed at the heart of everything I had bled for. I saw the clause granting Ethan golden parachute benefits, an escape hatch cushioned by our own funds, while his employees would be left scrambling for scraps. I felt the weight of the boardroom's collective greed, a force so palpable I could taste it on my tongue. They didn't mention loyalty. They didn't mention integrity. They talked about shareholder value, as if it were the only truth worth living by. The language was clinical: due diligence, equity reallocation, divestiture, but the intent was visceral, to erase the past and seize control of a future I had envisioned differently. Ethan spoke with conviction, eyes flicking to mine only briefly, an acknowledgement of my presence, polished and detached. In that glance I saw the trade-off he had made, his father's trust for his own ascent. I saw the moment he signed off on cutting the very team who'd toiled beside us through storms and recessions, his own childhood friends who had become the company's backbone. He had made a deal not just with partners, but with his own conscience. And I could sense the fracture line where it cracked. I imagined that conscience, fragile and battered, bending to the allure of power. And while he pitched benefits to investors, I grieved for the toll it would take on the people who believed in him, and in me. All around me, hands reached for pens, dotted the papers with initials, sealing each clause with a flourish. They believed the deal was done. I looked down at my own hands, still unmarked, and felt a calm settle over me. My silence was no longer compliance. It was strategy. They saw only a quiet old man, content to let the young lion claim his throne. They didn't realize that in my silence I was mapping every error, every hidden trap they'd laid. I was gathering proof of every malicious word, every twisted promise. I was learning their tactics so I could turn them against them. The final slide read, "Next steps." It was an invitation to sign these papers, to finalize this betrayal. Ethan nodded at me, waiting. His gaze was expectant, as though he half expected me to congratulate him. But I remained still. And in that silence, the silent war began. One that would be fought not with words, but with evidence, timing, and the knowledge that I held the ultimate leverage. The company's founding charter, locked away in my personal vault, with terms no investor had ever seen. Terms that could void the entire agreement. I looked at Ethan once more, and though I said nothing, my eyes conveyed the message. I was no longer the passive founder. I was a man scorned, and I held the power to reshape the fate of everything he'd built and destroyed in this room. The war was silent, but it was far from over. The door swung open, and 2 leather-bound folders landed on the polished mahogany table with a soft thud. They looked innocuous, almost elegant in their simplicity. Black covers, gold embossing. But to me, they were steel blocks, heavy with finality. The lawyer, a man whose polished shoes had probably never touched a factory floor, cleared his throat. "We just need a signature from the original founder," he said smoothly, sliding one folder toward me. His eyes flicked to Ethan and back to me, as though I were a puzzle piece that barely fit. On the cover was our company's crest, redesigned, sanitized, reborn for a new era. I traced the edges with my eyes, recalling the original ink sketch I'd drawn for Ethan's mother in a moment of late-night inspiration. That sketch had lived in my desk drawer for 20 years. This folder showed the world that it never existed. Ethan leaned forward, voice low and urgent. "Just sign, Dad," he whispered. His lips curved into a half-smile that tried to mask excitement and something deeper, though I couldn't tell if it was guilt or triumph. I picked up the pen, cold metal pressed between my fingers. The room held its breath. Investors watched like spectators at a grand finale. They all expected my compliance, my fatherly nod, the final stroke. But I hesitated. I looked at Ethan's face, all confidence and ambition, waiting for the seal of his victory. But in that moment he looked almost small, like a child waiting for approval, and I felt something fracture inside me, the man I raised, the strategist I groomed, now pleading for my pen. I signed. The ink flowed steadily, leaving a trail that felt like the sound of a lock clicking shut. The lawyer closed the folder with a satisfied snap. The investors exhaled, nodding approvingly. Ethan leaned back, relief flooding his features. But as I watched him bask in that relief, a quiet fury rose in me. Because while they all saw the signature as the culmination of a deal, I saw it as the closing of an old chapter, and the beginning of my own move. They didn't know the papers they'd just received weren't the final versions I'd reviewed. They didn't realize I'd slipped in an amendment weeks ago, something buried deep in the clauses they believed they controlled. They thought the founder's signature meant the end of my involvement. They hadn't read the fine print that ensured nothing moved forward without my express consent at every stage. They hadn't anticipated that I'd encoded the company's survival into terms only I understood. As the folder was taken away, I let the silence settle. No one noticed the faint smile tugging at my lips, too busy celebrating their triumph to sense that the real game was just beginning. Ethan caught my eye, gratitude and pride dancing in his expression. I didn't return it. Instead, I nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and rose from my chair. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd silenced the founder with a single signature. But in that quiet moment, I reveled in the power that signature granted me. The power to rewrite the rules, to reclaim my legacy, to watch as the empire they thought they'd acquired unraveled at the seams they didn't even know existed. And as I walked out of that boardroom, pen still warm in my hand, I knew the next moves would be swift and utterly final. A month before that boardroom showdown, long before the leather folders arrived with their gilded promises, I had slipped into the archives, my private domain of dusty files and hidden contracts. The company's legal team thought I was out of town that week, visiting an overseas supplier. They wouldn't question a founder's trip. It was expected. What they didn't know was that I wasn't delegating. I was scheming. I spent nights poring over the charter, the bylaws, the amendments no one had read in years. I traced each authority the board and the CEO claimed, the power to sell assets, to merge, to restructure, and I found the loophole buried in archaic language, a founder's prerogative, a clause I had drafted 2 decades ago during a moment of foresight and fear, granting me unilateral veto power over any fundamental alteration of corporate mission and structure. At the time, I'd assumed no one would ever invoke it. After all, we built this on trust. But trust had brittle edges. Ambition had fractured everything. With a trembling hand, half from age, half from knowing how close I was to breaking everything I loved, I restructured the Articles of Incorporation. I rewrote the definitions of control and approval, tethering every major decision to an updated founder's consent clause. I presented it to our outside counsel under the guise of routine housekeeping. I watched them skim through the pages, trusting me, the man who still had his faded garage jacket and grease under his nails. They filed my amendments without a second thought. It was my signature, quiet, unremarked in a sea of paperwork, that would hold the entire acquisition at bay. So when the deal papers came, thick and final, they believed my signature freed them. They thought it launched their takeover. Instead, it activated my silent firewall. No board vote could override the newly fortified clauses. No investor coalition could push through without my express written consent at each phase. The power they imagined they'd wrested from me was an illusion, a phantom born of their own hubris. In the weeks that followed, I watched them scramble. Emails flew in panicked bursts. Lawyers dissected the charter, hands shaking as they discovered the amendments. Ethan's confident emails turned into desperate meeting requests. The investors frantically convened emergency sessions, murmuring about legal challenges and fiduciary duty. But every argument they raised met the same unbreakable wall: founders' approval required. And I remained silent, hidden behind the fine print. I felt a fierce satisfaction, tempered by sorrow. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was a reckoning for every late-night sacrifice, every dream I'd poured into that company. It was justice for the erasure of my name, the betrayal of my legacy, the cold dismissal of my years. Yet in the quiet triumph, I mourned the son I thought I knew, the boy who looked at gears and saw possibility, now lost behind a man who saw only leverage. But the chapters ahead belonged to me. The story I built would not end on their terms, nor on his. And as the architects of the takeover realized their prize was locked behind my claws, I felt a fierce hope rise, that sometimes the subtlest signatures carry the greatest power. They beamed at me as I slid the folder across the table, their eyes alight with triumph. In that moment, I felt the weight of every handshake I'd missed, every unspoken dinner apology, every late-night struggle crystallize into a single silent verdict. They didn't notice the slight difference in the embossing, the extra paragraph tucked between the covers, my paragraph, the one that transformed their victory into a hollow echo. Their faces glowed with the satisfaction of a deal well made. Ethan's eyes met mine, brimming with relief and pride, as though he'd just coronated himself king of an empire. He didn't see the truth in my calm expression, the quiet satisfaction that coursed through me like wildfire. They thought I was the final obstacle, the gatekeeper who could be appeased with a stroke of the pen. They didn't realize that the paper they held in their hands was a mirror, reflecting back every ambition they'd poured into it, now bound and powerless under the clauses I'd embedded. I felt a strange peace settle over me as the folders were whisked away. No protests, no last-minute objections, just the rustle of pages and the soft click of briefcases snapping shut. They were leaving, carrying with them the illusion of control, the emptiness of their triumph. Their footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing distant, and I sat in the silence they'd left behind, the silence of a man whose justice was carved in ink and sealed in fine print. In that quiet aftermath, I closed my eyes and remembered the boy who once sketched gears on the kitchen table and asked endless questions about how things worked. I remembered the father I'd been, taught by dreams and driven by hope. And as the echoes faded, I stood up, straightened my coat, and walked back through the halls of the company I'd built, reclaiming every step. My silence had spoken louder than any speech. My justice was complete, and from here on out, the story would be mine to write. The first tremor came in my inbox, an unread count swelling as if it knew the betrayal it carried. Red flags and exclamation marks danced beside subject lines. Urgent clarification needed. Hold on all transactions. Legal review request. Each one hit me like a shard of glass, a fractured echo of their smug applause earlier that afternoon. Behind my calm facade, my heart pounded with the fierce pulse of vindication. They thought they had secured the final piece, the founder's blessing. Instead, they'd unleashed chaos woven into every line I'd rewritten. I watched the sender's names scroll past. His investors, our board members, even the firm's own legal counsel, each message more frantic than the last. Then came the calls. My phone vibrated against the mahogany desk, an urgent drumbeat. I let them ring. On the third, I recognized Ethan's number. He hadn't called like this in years. He never used that tone. I could hear his panic, strained, high-pitched, the voice of the boy who once clung to my leg for reassurance. "What did you sign, Dad?" he demanded, breathless, frayed at the edges. He sounded smaller than he'd ever been. I didn't answer. Silence, after all, was what he wanted me to practice in that boardroom, but silence could be more potent than 100 rebuttals. I let him pace through his questions, feeling his desperation ripple through the line. He imagined I had betrayed him, sabotaged him. He didn't know the truth yet, that he had betrayed our history, and I was merely the instrument of its correction. Hundreds of miles away, in gleaming offices that once proudly bore our name, cracks had begun to spiderweb across their plans. Engines of progress ground to a halt. Automated systems flagged discrepancies. Board members convened emergency meetings, but every path forward met the brick wall of my amendments. I pictured them scouring the fine print, eyes widening as they realized their prize was shackled by the clauses they thought they'd bypassed. My own silence became my policy. Every unanswered call, every unread email, was a reminder of the power I still held. The right to sit quietly and watch as their perfect facade crumbled. In that quiet, I remembered the weight of every bolt I'd tightened with my own hands, every dawn I'd welcomed alone in that garage. Those memories were my fortress now, protecting the legacy they'd tried to erase. Ethan's frantic voice faded into voicemail. He left a string of messages, pleas, threats, accusations, and then, heartbreakingly, a single whisper, "Please." I set the phone down and closed my eyes, breathing in the stillness. In the silence, I found not regret, but resolve. The cracks had appeared, not because I'd unleashed a trap, but because the very foundations they'd tried to shatter were stronger than ambition alone. And as the evening light faded, I sat in the quiet, knowing that the next move rested with me, and me alone. When the dust finally settled, the boardroom felt colder than it ever had under my tenure. The same polished mahogany table where investors had toasted to their triumph now bore the weight of stunned silence. Ethan stood at the head of the table, shoulders hunched, his tailored suit somehow too large for the moment. His eyes flicked around the room, to the faces he had dazzled just hours ago, only to find disappointment etched on every brow. They looked at him not as a brilliant strategist, but as a boy who gambled away the family silver. The partners shuffled papers, exchanged glances, and cleared throats. An elder board member, someone who'd once nodded at my plans with respect, now stared with a mixture of frustration and betrayal. The words hung unspoken. "How did we misjudge you?" Ethan opened his mouth, searching for an answer, but the silence stretched too long. The truth had a way of flattening the bravado. He had no deal, no acquisition, no triumphant exit. In that moment, I realized the full measure of what I'd achieved. Not only had I blocked their takeover, I had wrested control back into the hands of the founder. The very clause they'd overlooked, the fine print fortress I'd built, had closed the door on their ambitions and ushered in a new reality, my reality. He stood there, an outsider, in a room he once commanded. His allies shifted uncomfortably, as though the ground beneath them had given way. The scoreboards of profit projections lay discarded, meaningless. Their numbers no longer spoke of conquest, but of humiliation. Ethan swallowed, his throat working as though he were trying to force back regret. He glanced at the door, then at me, though I was not present in body. My presence echoed through every amended article, every reclaimed right. He felt my judgment in the silent hum of the lights, in the creak of the chairs, in the absence of applause. Finally, a voice broke through the hush, a senior partner clearing his throat. "Mr. Reed," he said slowly, addressing me by title rather than by name, "it seems we have some clarification to address." The words were polite, but the edge was unmistakable. They weren't asking for permission, they were demanding explanation, and Ethan, stripped of his power and prestige, could only watch as I stepped into the room. My footsteps sure, my coat dusted from the archive's old papers. I passed by the astonished partners, each of whom had dismissed me as an anachronism. I felt the weight of every steel beam and concrete floor that had carried this company through storms far worse than corporate greed. When I reached the head of the table, I allowed myself a small, steadying breath. All eyes turned to me. I cleared my throat once. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice calm but resonant, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding our corporate governance." I laid out the amended clause in terms so simple that none could argue. The founder's prerogative was supreme, and without my express approval, no fundamental change could proceed. The room shifted again, disbelief giving way to grudging acceptance. Ethan's face, once so confident, had paled into something I barely recognized, fear mixed with shame. He had looked to me for validation, for a final word of approval, and found none. When I finished, the silence returned. Different now, heavier with the weight of truth. The partners accepted their failure, nodding reluctantly, while Ethan stood as the living testament to arrogance undone. He was an outsider, no longer the architect of their plans, but a footnote in a story I had reclaimed. As I turned to leave, I felt no triumph in his disgrace. Only the quiet victory of justice served. The company's heart beat once more under the stewardship of its founder, its legacy intact and its future redirected. And behind me, Ethan remained in the boardroom's cold glow, forced to reckon with the realization that in trying to silence me, he had only awakened the founder's voice, and that voice would never again be ignored. He found me the next morning in the old workshop, the one place that still smelled of sawdust and oil, where the sunlight slanted through high windows and danced on forgotten blueprints. There were no suits, no cameras, nothing but the echo of our shared history in the worn wood and rusted tools. He stood framed in the doorway, shoulders slumped, eyes rimmed with regret. And for a moment, I saw the boy who once chased me around this very floor, clutching a toy wrench as if it were Excalibur. His voice came out like gravel and glass, rough and fractured. "You ruined everything." I paused, running a hand over a workbench scarred by 1,000 late nights, each scratch a memory of determination. In that stillness, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I'd made, the skipped birthdays, the broken promises, the sleepless nights, coalesce into one simple truth. I turned to him without anger, only clarity. "No," I said quietly, my voice carrying the gravity of every unspoken hour. "You gave everything away. I just signed the papers." He looked at me then, really looked, and I sensed his understanding flicker like a candle's flame in a draught. He realized that the signature was not the betrayal. His choices were. The signature merely illuminated what he'd already done. He took a step forward, but the distance between us felt measured in years rather than feet. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence stretched between us, heavy, charged, final. Around us, the workshop hummed with memories. The first prototype we built side by side. The oil-stained gloves I'd banged on that very bench. The blueprint sketches pinned to the wall that marked every milestone of our journey. Those walls bore witness to a father's hope and a son's ambition, woven together until ambition began to unravel hope. He lowered his gaze. The bravado drained from his posture, and for the first time, he was quiet. No excuses. No defenses. Only the raw echo of truth in his eyes. I walked past him toward the open door, feeling the grain of the wood floor under my feet, each step a reclaiming of all I'd built. Behind me, his breath caught, subtle, almost lost in the space between us. But I didn't look back. My silence was no longer strategy. It was release. Outside, the morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of a new chapter. I could feel the sun on my face and the weight of the past lifting from my shoulders. The company would endure, rooted in values I'd fought to protect, and my place within it would be defined not by a title or a signature, but by the legacy of steadfast purpose. He remained in the doorway, alone, with the echoes of everything he'd set in motion. And this time, he had to sit quietly while I walked away.